something just shifted in the Middle East. And this time, the signals coming out of Washington, the Persian Gulf, and the waters surrounding the Strait of Hormuz are not the routine posturing that analysts have grown accustomed to dismissing. This is different. The pace is different. The scale is different. And for the first time in several years, the machinery of a large-scale American military response is visibly, unmistakably in motion. Not as a rehearsal, not as a drill, but as a direct reaction to a series of Iranian actions that senior U.S. officials have described, in language rarely used in public, as crossing a threshold that can no longer be absorbed without consequence. That phrase, crossing a red line, gets used so frequently in geopolitical commentary that it has nearly lost its meaning. But what makes this moment different is not the language. It is what is happening on the water, in the air, and on the decks of assault ships currently repositioning across the Arabian Sea. When amphibious-ready groups begin moving, when marine units are placed in forward deployment posture, and when strategic bombers begin flying continuous patrol arcs over a region, it means that someone in the decision-making chain has concluded that the situation can no longer be managed through diplomatic signaling alone. That conclusion has now been reached, and the world is watching what comes next. To understand why this moment carries a weight that separates it from the dozens of previous confrontations between the United States and Iran over the past 2 decades, you have to understand what Iran actually did and why the timing of those actions was so strategically provocative. The incident that set this escalation in motion was not a single event. It was a sequence, compressed into a narrow window of time that combined maritime disruption, a long-range strike attempt, and a deliberate challenge to the architecture of deterrence that the United States and its allies have spent years constructing in the region. Iranian-linked forces were reported to have significantly disrupted activity along one of the most critical global shipping corridors in the world. The disruption was not symbolic. Thousands of commercial vessels transit this corridor annually, carrying energy supplies, raw materials, and finished goods that form the backbone of global trade. When that corridor is threatened, the economic reverberations are not confined to the region. They are felt in fuel prices, in shipping insurance rates, in the quarterly earnings of multinational companies, and in the strategic calculations of governments from Tokyo to Berlin. But the maritime disruption, significant as it was not the action that triggered the most urgent response from Washington. That came from a reported attempted long-range strike directed at a joint US-UK military installation, a remote but operationally significant base that represents one of the key forward nodes in the Western Alliance's regional presence. The strike was intercepted before it reached its target. Defensive systems performed as designed. There were no casualties reported at the facility. And in the immediate hours following the interception, official statements from both Washington and London were carefully calibrated, acknowledging the incident without providing the full operational details that would have told adversaries exactly what they needed to know about the gaps and capabilities of the intercepting systems. Here is where the narrative becomes more consequential than the headline suggests. The fact that the strike was intercepted does not reduce its strategic significance. If anything, it increases it. An intercepted strike is still a strike. It is still a deliberate act of aggression against a joint military facility belonging to 2 of the world's most powerful military alliances. It is still evidence that the calculation on the other side has shifted, that someone in Tehran's strategic hierarchy made a decision that the potential gains of that action outweighed the risks of the response it would provoke. That calculation is the story. Because when a government makes that decision, it is telling you something about what it believes the response will be, and what it believes it can withstand. For years, the U.S. posture in the Middle East has been one of deliberate strategic ambiguity. Washington has maintained a significant military presence in the region, conducted exercises, issued warnings, and periodically deployed additional assets during periods of heightened tension. But the underlying message, delivered more through restraint than through action, was that the threshold for direct military engagement remained high, and that the costs of miscalculation would fall primarily on the side that miscalculated. Iran's leadership, watching that pattern over time, developed its own theory of the situation. That theory held that as long as actions remained below a certain threshold of direct confrontation, the American response would be measured, delayed, and ultimately manageable. The attempted strike against a joint US-UK facility tested that theory. The response now unfolding suggests the theory was wrong. The United States military's current positioning in the region is not improvised. It is the product of contingency planning that has been in various stages of preparation for years, updated regularly as Iran's capabilities evolved and as the strategic environment shifted. What is notable about the current deployment is its composition. Amphibious ready groups are not the same as carrier strike groups. They serve a different operational function, where carrier strike groups are primarily power projection platforms, designed to deliver sustained air power over a theater. Amphibious ready groups are designed to project ground combat power from the sea. They carry marines. They carry landing craft. They carry the equipment, the logistics, and the command infrastructure required to conduct operations that begin in the water and end on land. The decision to move multiple such groups toward the Middle East region is a signal that is being read very carefully by military analysts, by regional governments, and almost certainly by decision-makers in Tehran. The Marine units currently positioned as part of this buildup are not being described as a symbolic presence. Thousands of personnel are forward deployed and positioned for what official language carefully describes as rapid response or contingency scenarios. That language is deliberately vague. But contingency scenarios in the context of an amphibious ready group deployment to a region where the primary threat is an adversary with extensive coastal defenses, coastal missile batteries, and a naval doctrine built around denying access and control of key waterways. That language points toward a very specific operational logic. Overhead, the air picture is equally significant. Strategic bombers are conducting what the military describes as continuous patrols, a term that carries considerable weight in the lexicon of deterrence operations. Continuous patrols are not training flights. They are not routine exercises. They are a deliberate, sustained signal of capability and readiness, designed to communicate to an adversary that the capacity to strike is not just theoretical, not just resident on a distant base, but present, airborne, and maintained around the clock. Paired with advanced tactical aircraft providing close air support and air superiority coverage, the air posture being assembled over the region represents one of the most concentrated forward deployments of U.S. air power in recent memory. All of this is converging on a specific geography that makes the current situation uniquely dangerous. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the broader Arabian Sea, is not simply a symbolic flashpoint. It is one of the most operationally consequential choke points on the planet. Approximately 20 to 21 million barrels of oil pass through the strait every single day, accounting for roughly 20% of global petroleum consumption. The strait is, at its narrowest point, approximately 33 kilometers wide, and within that width, the navigable shipping channel is significantly narrower. Placing a naval force of any size into that geometry creates immediate operational constraints. Mine-laying, coastal missile batteries, fast attack craft operating in swarm configurations, and unmanned systems deployed in layered denial patterns are all documented components of Iranian military doctrine for the strait. This is not a theoretical threat. It is a documented, exercised, and publicly acknowledged strategic capability. Iran's asymmetric military posture represents one of the most studied problems in contemporary military analysis. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, operating separately from the conventional Iranian Navy, has spent decades developing a doctrine specifically designed to complicate the operational calculus of a technologically superior adversary. Anti-ship ballistic missiles with demonstrated range and accuracy. Anti-ship cruise missiles capable of sea-skimming flight profiles that challenge radar detection and interception timelines. Drone swarms that can overwhelm point defense systems through saturation. Quiet diesel-electric submarines operating in shallow, geographically complex waters where acoustic detection becomes considerably more difficult. Proxy networks and aligned regional forces across multiple countries that can be activated to create simultaneous pressure points, forcing a numerically and logistically stretched adversary to divide attention and resources across multiple fronts simultaneously. The strategic logic of Iran's approach has always been to make the cost of direct military engagement prohibitively high, not by matching U.S. military power symmetrically, which is not possible and has never been the goal, but by making the pathway to decisive victory so costly, so uncertain, and so potentially destabilizing to global energy markets that the political will to pursue it would erode before the military objective could be achieved. That doctrine has worked, in various forms, for decades. What is being tested right now is whether it continues to work when the actions that trigger a potential response cross from the manageable into the direct. The energy infrastructure dimension of this situation cannot be understated, and it is clearly central to the operational planning now underway on the American side. The critical oil and gas production and processing facilities in the broader Gulf region are not just economic assets. They are the physical substrate of global energy security. A significant disruption to those facilities, whether through direct military action, through supply route interference, or through the kind of coordinated pressure campaign that Iran and its regional aligned forces have demonstrated they are capable of executing, would send shockwaves through the global economy that would not be contained within the region. Oil prices would spike. Shipping insurance rates would become prohibitive for commercial operators. The global supply chains that depend on predictable, affordable energy costs would begin to fracture. The countries most exposed to that fracture, energy importing nations in Asia, in Europe, in the developing world, would face economic pressures that their governments would be unable to absorb without political consequences. This is not a regional crisis with regional consequences. It is a regional flashpoint with global reach. That global dimension is why the current situation is being watched with acute attention in capitals far beyond Washington and Tehran. Beijing, which has a direct and strategic interest in stable energy flows through the Gulf to fuel its manufacturing economy, is monitoring developments very carefully. The Chinese government has maintained a studied public silence on the specific incident that triggered the current escalation, but its economic exposure to a sustained Gulf disruption is significant enough that its private diplomatic communications are almost certainly more active than its public statements suggest. Moscow, which has its own calculus around global oil prices and around the strategic value of keeping the United States entangled in a demanding regional commitment rather than free to project attention and resources elsewhere, is also following developments with considerable interest. Neither Beijing nor Moscow has a straightforward interest in a full-scale military conflict in the Gulf. Both have significant interest in an environment of sustained instability that drains American strategic attention, military resources, and political capital. The European dimension adds another layer of complexity. Several key NATO allies maintain their own military assets in the region and have deep economic exposure to Gulf energy flows. The United Kingdom's involvement, given the joint base that was the target of the reported strike attempt, makes London a direct party to the current confrontation rather than an observer. British officials have been careful in their public statements, but the presence of a joint facility as a target means that the Article 5 considerations that govern NATO's collective defense obligations are, at minimum, a background consideration in every strategic conversation happening right now between Washington and London. And here is where the picture becomes most difficult to read, and where the strategic uncertainty that defines the current moment reaches its highest intensity. The United States has assembled a formidable military capability in and around the Gulf region. The deterrent signal being sent is unmistakable in its scale and composition. But military capability and deterrent signaling are only effective insofar as they alter the decision-making calculus of the adversary being deterred. And Iran's decision-making calculus, at this particular moment in its history, is subject to pressures that external observers cannot fully measure. Iran is not operating from a position of unconstrained strategic choice. Decades of sustained economic pressure have significantly constrained the country's financial resources, its technological development, and its ability to project hard power beyond the immediate region. The Iranian rial has lost enormous value. Inflation has imposed severe costs on ordinary Iranians. The domestic political environment, though not openly democratic, is subject to pressures and fissures that complicate the leadership's ability to project external boldness while simultaneously managing internal discontent. The strategic question that military analysts are now debating in Washington, London, and other allied capitals is whether that internal pressure is making Iran's leadership more cautious, more likely to back down in the face of a credible military buildup, or whether it is making them more likely to escalate, on the logic that an external confrontation could consolidate internal support and distract from domestic grievances. History offers examples of both patterns. Governments under economic and political stress have, on some occasions, backed away from confrontations with more powerful adversaries when the military signal became sufficiently clear. On other occasions, they have escalated precisely when the costs of backing down, in terms of domestic political standing, regional prestige, and the credibility of their deterrent posture, appeared to outweigh the risks of continued confrontation. The Iranian leadership has spent decades watching how the United States responds to various forms of pressure. They have their own assessment of American political will, and that assessment, whatever it currently holds, is the variable that no amount of external military positioning can fully control. The analysts closest to this situation, those working in strategic policy institutions, in the national security communities of allied governments, and in the research centers that specialize in Gulf security, are working through a matrix of possible scenarios that range from controlled de-escalation to something far more serious. One scenario involves a combination of direct kinetic response to the attempted strike, targeted enough to be proportional and credible, but limited enough to avoid triggering a full escalation spiral, combined with a sustained naval presence designed to reassert freedom of navigation through the contested waterways. A second scenario involves a broader campaign against specific Iranian military infrastructure, the missile production facilities, the drone manufacturing networks, the command nodes of the IRGC's naval forces, designed not to topple the government but to degrade the specific capabilities that enable the asymmetric threat posture. A third scenario, one that analysts are careful to frame as contingency rather than probability, involves a more comprehensive operational effort that targets not just military infrastructure but the broader support network that sustains Iran's regional power projection. Each of those scenarios carries different requirements, different risks, and different potential consequences for the region, for global energy markets, and for the broader geopolitical order that has governed the Middle East for the past 3 decades. The first is the most politically manageable but may not be sufficient to alter the underlying strategic calculus. The second carries significant operational complexity and meaningful risk of miscalculation. The third, if it ever reached the point of serious planning, would represent a strategic commitment of a scale and consequence that would reshape the regional order in ways that are genuinely difficult to model. What makes the current moment so consequential is not just what has already happened. It is the recognition, visible in the composition of the forces being deployed, in the language being used by officials, and in the pace of the military buildup, that the decision-making process has moved into a phase where the window for purely diplomatic resolution is narrowing rather than widening. The assets being moved into position are not assets that governments deploy simply to apply pressure and then quietly redeploy when the pressure achieves its effect. They are assets that have operational significance, that require forward logistics and support chains, and that represent a level of commitment that carries its own momentum. Deploying them is a decision. Redeploying them without a clearly visible strategic outcome is a different kind of decision, one with its own costs and its own consequences for the credibility of deterrence going forward. The Strait of Hormuz will remain the geographic focal point of whatever unfolds next. Its physical characteristics make it a place where military confrontation, if it comes, would be compressed into a narrow, intensely complex operational environment where the speed of events would almost certainly outpace the speed of political decision-making. The history of naval incidents in confined waters, from the Persian Gulf incidents of the 1980s to the more recent pattern of seizures incidents and near misses in the decades that followed, demonstrates consistently that once kinetic action begins in that geography, the ability to control escalation diminishes rapidly. Every government involved in the current standoff understands this. Understanding it, however, has not historically been sufficient to prevent the kind of incident that begins a chain of events that none of the parties initially intended. The global economy is watching because it has no choice. Oil markets have already begun to price in a risk premium that reflects the uncertainty of the current moment. Shipping operators navigating through or around the Gulf are making real-time decisions about routes, timing, and insurance coverage. Refiners in Asia and Europe are running scenario assessments on supply availability under various disruption conditions. These are not hypothetical exercises. They are the operational responses of commercial actors to a geopolitical risk environment that has, in a matter of days, shifted from elevated to acute. What has fundamentally changed in this situation is not just the scale of the U.S. military response, though that scale is significant. What has changed is the implied threshold. For years, the operating assumption across the region has been that there exists a ceiling of Iranian provocation below which the American response would be measured, predictable, and ultimately non-transformative of the strategic environment. That ceiling has now been explicitly challenged. Whether it holds, whether it moves, or whether the events of the coming days demonstrate that it was never as fixed as anyone believed, that is the question that will define not just the immediate crisis, but the structure of regional security for years to come. The signals to watch are specific. Watch the movement of additional naval assets, particularly whether additional carrier strike groups join the amphibious ready groups already repositioning in the region. That combination would indicate a shift from deterrence-heavy to strike-capable positioning. Watch the diplomatic channels between Washington and Tehran through intermediaries. Oman has historically served as a back channel in previous periods of acute tension, and whether that channel is active or silent will tell analysts something important about the current state of communication. Watch the response of Gulf Cooperation Council member states, particularly those with critical energy infrastructure, whose own security posture and public statements will reflect their private assessment of how serious the threat has become. And watch Iran's next move, specifically, whether the next action, if it comes, is designed to signal a willingness to negotiate from a position of pressure, or whether it is designed to demonstrate that the current buildup has not altered the underlying strategic calculation. None of those signals will tell the full story on their own, but together, read against the backdrop of what has already occurred and the military posture now being assembled, they will indicate whether the current crisis is moving toward a managed and bounded confrontation, toward an extended standoff with significant but contained consequences, or toward something that neither side intended and that none of the world's governments, whatever their stated positions, actually wants. The Middle East has been through moments of apparent certainty before, moments when the trajectory seemed clear, when the logic of escalation seemed to demand a predictable outcome, and when the situation instead turned in a direction that surprised everyone involved. But it has also been through moments when the cumulative weight of individual decisions, each rational in isolation, produced an outcome that was collectively catastrophic. The challenge for every actor in this situation, in Washington, in Tehran, in London, in Riyadh, in Beijing, in Moscow, is to read this moment correctly, to understand what the other side will and will not do, to distinguish between signals that indicate genuine strategic intent and signals designed to manage domestic audiences or regional perceptions, to make decisions under conditions of significant uncertainty, with significant consequences attached to being wrong. That challenge is not theoretical. It is being lived right now by the people in the decision-making rooms, and it is why this moment, for all the complexity and ambiguity that surrounds it, is one that the world cannot afford to look away from. This report is based on observable developments and strategic analysis, with some details still evolving as events continue to unfold.